Spread the fire, fam. Welcome back to SMWX, the Sizwe Mpofu-Walsh Xperience. In this episode, we speak about this brilliant book, The Economy on Your Doorstep by Ayabonga Cawe. We delve into economic questions, rap, consumption, and what it means to write a book as a young South African. Hope you enjoy this fascinating episode. Let's get started. Ayeye. So, bro, this is an important book. It's a book that is also well written. So I want to get into some questions about craft as well as the substance. But first, the first part of this book is about overcoming what you call the native reserve. That's the largest part. That's the first part. And you really set up a kind of frame through which you view the economy and the interventions that are needed. So in a nutshell, can you take us through why you kind of went back to go forward and why you think this idea of the native reserve is still important for present-day South Africa?
Political economy became something very important to try and understand, who I am, where I came from, and the economic reality of those places that I've experienced and interacted with. So in a sense, this book is really about places I know, places I grew up around, and using those as an entry point to a systemic inquiry about not only the economic evolution of those places, but also the life processes that are embedded in that economic and social change. And I think the native reserve is an important one. I mean, a lot of people were saying to me, well, why do you only talk about the homelands? And I say the concept of the native reserve goes beyond the homeland. Because if you think about even in the urban context, in places like Cape Town and East London, when you get to Mtanzane, it's say NU1 or say NU13. That is a native unit. So the method of creating these compounds of concentration for African people as spaces where they go only to rest and to wake up again and work for industry, this temporary life, this temporary citizenship in the urban space is a replica of what the homeland experiment and the balkanization of South Africa had already started to do in the rural areas. And so in a sense, I draw this relational link because our lives work like that way. I come from a village, on your way to Dordrecht, it's part of the sort of Lady Frere area. And it's a matter of course, traditionally every generation at a certain age, you go to Johannesburg or Cape Town. So in a sense, the sociological existence of those people creates that relational link between the urban and the rural in very meaningful ways for capital accumulation in South Africa. So that's my starting point. And that's why I want to understand the economy on my doorstep as a window and an entry point into a more systemic inquiry around how we resolve what I call, the messy tasks of the South African Revolution. And those messy tasks are primarily, in this phase of that revolution, economic. And for you to start to understand those, you can't understand them without understanding the unfolding of the late 19th century and 20th century South Africa and the interface between politics and the kind of economy that emerges and the role of these people that have been placed in the wastelands of the South African experiment and how their lives unfold even now in the contemporary period. So, and also I think for me, I can't, I hate to say it like this, but I don't think people who are engaged in economic inquiry should do what the profession has done in the 20th century, which is to create this idea that you're the belle of the social sciences. You can't learn without really, I guess, trying to colonize other parts of the social sciences. And so in a sense for me, understanding of history is as important to economic inquiry now. And what that translates to in broadcasting, in policy spaces and beyond that. So I go backwards to try and understand where I am now and what the future might look like. But it's a critical part of my toolkit as an economist to also be a student of history. Because I don't think if you are really interested in making sure that you are an economist who's of value to your people, that you can do that without interrogating and having a very intimate understanding of their history.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because on the one hand, what you're doing is you're going back and forth in time, you're going back to show us where we are and where we should go. But I also felt that the work was interesting in that it was at different scales. So it's the economy on your doorstep. So you're really taking people into how this economy affects your life on a day-to-day basis right now. But then you zoom out quite a lot as well and reflect on broad economic trends. And so I'm interested in how did the idea for this book happen? Because it's an unconventional economic book in that it's moving through time and it's moving through scales.
It's interesting because this is not a book that I had thought of writing. I got a call from a certain publisher who was like, look, we're really interested. We've seen some of the work that you write, much shorter pieces, of course. And we'd really like to see if you're considering writing a book. And I said to them, yeah, sure, And I think 3 months after I spoke to them, only then did I start to think about writing this book. And I think this book, in a way, has been a few years in the making, because a lot of what I ended up writing, especially in the long-form essays in the first part of the book, were things I tried to think about, interrogate, and try and make sense of. And I think the puzzle was only complete when I think I completed the manuscript. Because in a way now it makes me look at that environment with new eyes. I mean, I was in the Eastern Cape about, a week ago. And everywhere I go now, themes that are in the book are just popping up, in different parts of that particular province. And I'm interested in it not just because I come from there, but I'm interested in how its heterogeneity gives us an insight into our unique brand of capitalist accumulation in South Africa. And unique, even that has its own limitations, but also our, what I call world-beating levels of inequality and unemployment. There are countries in the world that are much poorer than South Africa, but that have much higher levels of economic participation than South Africa. Now, you can't explain that within the toolkit of neoclassical economics. You're going to have to go to your history. You're going to have to go to the archive. You're going to have to go, to the historic and oral archive of our people, from an economic and even a political perspective, to be able to uncover how policy, that's not divine action. That was the outcome of intentional policy to take away the economic and livelihood alternatives of African people so that they can come to the mill, to the farm, to the factory, out of a desperation that allows you to pay them even subsistence wages. And that's how the system accumulates. That's how its profit motive accumulates over space and time. And I say that's the foundational habit, and it's a habit, we are yet to break out of. It's a habit, to which we are prone to recurrent relapse. And I think the current moment we're in now, with austerity, with, struggles around, for instance, the national minimum wage and how capital is responding to that, are indicative of the fact that those old ghosts do not rest. The sense that you can still accumulate on the basis of the South African formation being one that shifts all the costs of creating successive generations of the workforce to the township, to the village. And capital has no, capital externalizes that cost in order to accumulate and to maximize profit. But in a sense, what it does is create multi-generational psychosocial and economic trauma.
Absolutely. And on that note, later in part one, you've got this interesting essay on Kaundenzumtu.
Sure.
And you talk about how in the present economy, the way to overcome some of those psychosocial and economic afflictions is through consumption. So we almost try, particularly as people who are racialized as black, to consume our way out of the problems into which we've been, and the corners into which we've been placed. Firstly, you must be the only person who's ever put Big Zulu into an economics book.
And
I just
Kanye,
and Kanye, for that matter. I just want to read this section quickly for the viewers, because my goodness, I never thought I'd see this, but it's just it's testament to the innovation of this book. So you say, in the music we listen to, Big Zulu's pursuit of imali eningi, a lot of money, is not unrelated to the immediate link between such money and immediate consumption. Or what Kanye West in a 2004 song, All Falls Down, suggested was the impulse to buy a lot of clothes when we don't really need them. Things we buy to cover up what's inside. Because they made us hate ourselves and love their wealth. So, like, take us through that and how consumption is working today in a way that kind of hits people's psychosocial situation.
Yeah. You know, it's so interesting, Sizwe. I mean, I'm a hip hop head, you know, and I think hip hop was able to explain a lot of things in my life, especially as a teenager, where what I was learning at home or even learning at school couldn't fill that gap, you know. But I'm also very conscious that music and popular culture is also able to transmit certain messages that are in line with, I guess, whatever, you know, psychosocial compulsions are out there in the society. And so for me, it was about saying these things are not unrelated. We have to draw the connections between these different things. So if I come back to the history, you must remember that. So I grew up in Queenstown. Queenstown is in the Republic of South Africa at the time. On the sort of, I would say, the eastern side of Queenstown, you have the Republic of the Transkei becomes independent in 1976. On the other side, you've got the Ciskei, which, you know, becomes independent a few years later. So in a way, anybody who lives in this sort of liminal space in Queenstown is somebody who is there as a partial citizen or as an exception in the legislation. So you're a Section 10 Bantu. And that's Section 10 of a certain act. I think it was a Bantu Urban Authorities Act or something like that. Now, that's the same act that clears the way for the removal of Sophiatown and effectively clearing of the black spaces in the urban or peri-urban parts of the South African society. But what it does is that it creates a very visceral attachment between one's legitimacy and citizenship in space and participation in the wage economy. So you can't live in Mlungisi if you were born outside of Mlungisi, if you can't prove that you have a pass that's signed by your employer or that you've worked for the same employer for more than 15 years. I think that was what the legislation said. Now that already, at a very deep level, creates in the mindset of the African people this intimate link between participation in the wage economy and the consumption that allows for, and notions of citizenship and worth. And you then get to a paradox of the current moment where you have crisis levels of unemployment even higher than what we had during apartheid in some cases, in a society that has the kind of lumpen patriarchy that you see and all of the other issues that come with it, where your worth is determined by what you have and what you consume, in a society where the majority of people don't have the avenues to be able to get the cash that allows them that kind of consumption. So it creates this societal angst in a way, and a very burning contradiction, where you've got, in a society of mass unemployment, a lingering mindset that says your worth, your legitimacy, and even your citizenship as a person is based on your participation in wage labor and what you can consume. And I argue that in the post-apartheid period, you've had a redistributive project whose distributional consequence hasn't touched on the profit share. And one of the ways that has occurred is through the functional mechanism of credit. So if you look at credit extension over what are called now in hindsight, you know, the periods of growth in the South African economy, that consumptive-led growth boom that accompanied the commodity boom around the 2000s, where people say, Thabo Mbeki was growing the economy. There's a lot of other conjunctural factors that fit into that. But what it does at the level of the African household is that it creates, in a context of a lack of meaningful economic realignment of the society, it creates this notion of a freedom in consumption. So your freedom now is you are free to go to the same Mr. Price that the madam used to go to, that you might not have been allowed to go to. But in a way, it's a freedom that feeds a financializing capitalism under specific conditions in the South African economy, and does so in a context where there's a stagnant wage share of national income. We then become shocked, oh, but the economy was growing, but we became a more unequal society. Well, you became a more unequal society because what happened in that consumptive boom was that it was consumption and a redistribution of resources without touching on the profit share that was in a way funneled through the functional mechanism of credit. And that's why the NCR comes in 2008, because you start to see this mechanism is running away, but you also see globally that finance capitalism reaches a crisis point. One of many crisis points, of course, but in that particular sense, it's a crisis point that intersects with the project of creating a black middle class in the first instance, through procurement, through state hiring decisions. It also intersects with this process of the expansion of social security. And you start to see this process where bigger and bigger proportions of household income in the native reserve are financed through social transfers. And I'm saying we've been reckless in not being able to say, how do we channel that type of consumption that is facilitated through intentional state policy in ways that reindustrialize our economy? So every month, if you go and watch, at a post office or even at a SASA queue in a mall, if you would do a time lapse there, so I like doing this kind of stuff. You would do a time lapse, you would be able to map out that one-way traffic. So I go and stand there at 6 a.m. in the morning. I collect my money at the ATM or whatever. I go straight to ShopRite or Boxer superstores. In a moment when you know your mainstream food system is run by what I would say in political terms is your class enemy. But you're hungry, so yeah, go and buy. But my issue is that you don't resolve that by saying now, Sizwe, go and create another supermarket. Because the market structure will chuck you out as soon as you start. But what you do is you say, let us create a cashless component in the improvement of that grant. So if our plan for the next 5 years is that we want to go to a universal basic income, let's start with a hybrid approach that says, Sizwe, you will get a voucher, say it's 900 Rand. You will get a 450 Rand voucher as part of this universal basic income. But you can only go and spend it at the municipal market that sources its stuff from the land reform beneficiary, that sources its stuff from the food garden at the back of the church in the community. So that we begin to shift our spaces away from just being spaces, to look after the old and the young, and to prepare those who are going to the labor market, who come back when they're sick and come back to die. So how do we produce in our own spaces, in these townships and in these rural areas? But you're not going to do that if you don't catalyze that by creating a market for those producers before they even put the first seed in the ground.
No, that's fascinating, and just almost turning the consumptive tendencies of the economy to our own benefit. I mean, if they're going to be there for the foreseeable future, we might as well use them, right, instead of squandering them.
But I think on that, Sizwe, there's also a question mark. And, a lot of the people who've bought the book, I would say are elites, people like you and me who are, probably not the atypical type of person who is still in the native reserve. Of course, we touch by it in meaningful ways.
Sure.
But it's also a criticism of the national aspiration and agenda of this class that has been created. We don't have one. So it's then unsurprising that when somebody goes, they get a tender, they make a killing, the first thing they do is to go to a dealership in Sandton.
Well, what's really interesting to me is actually the intersection of politics and rap music at that moment, because there are two classes of people who aspire to this consumerist lifestyle, right? It's the politicians who are speaking with two mouths, like a revolutionary rhetoric and then driving what they're driving and all of that. But then there are the rap artists who are like, no, you know what? I'm just going to live. I'm going to speak and live the ideal. And it's really fascinating to me the role that these two figures play in contemporary South Africa with this consumptive
and
economic
I think,
model.
you know, for me, even in hip-hop, as much or as important as the political space, there is this question of a conceptual and ideological integrity. So being able to, yes, you know, this idea, a lot of people say, you know, ANC, walk left, talk right. Talk left, walk right. I think that's the characterization. And I think in the public mindset, there is that perception of leaders in the society, irrespective of the political camp they come from, that a politician or somebody who is a musician or somebody who, you know, works around people must be allowed to accumulate in a very crass manner. Now, I don't know. I don't know about that, because my reading of most post-colonial experiences is that there is a need, especially in the Asian experience, you see this sense of a generational sacrifice at the point of transition. Now, sacrifice insofar as saying there must be certain societally placed limits to accumulation and the consumption of that accumulation. Now, people might say, but now you're curtailing our freedom to spend whatever. Yeah, that's fine. Go spend whatever. But it can't be that is left to market forces alone to determine. Because what they're going to do, as I do argue in the case of Lewis, the furniture store, is to create more and more opportunities for the merchandise to fly off the showroom. And if that means they're going to use credit, if that means they're going to blaze it up on your, you know, speakers, on your smartphone, they're going to do it. And I think the big question is, how do you then, in meaningful ways, be able to direct the growth of that type of consumptive class? You know, the Chinese make a very interesting case in this. I mean, there's a growing segment of luxury consumers in China. But those luxury consumers will not be hegemonic in China, because the type of economic system in China places very clear political limits to the expansion of the market. That's why they say they have a socialist system with certain types of capitalist characteristics, because socialism is a transitional program to communism, if that's what people are interested in. But socialism also implies the existence of market forces under certain conditions. And in this country, that's been, you know, in a way, that's been the holy cow. You can't touch market forces. So when the competition authorities implement the law and they say, Burger King, you can't sell Grand Parade steaks in Burger King if there's no black people involved, the people get scared. Yeah, you want a command economy? Well, we want an economy that in meaningful ways ensures that people's opportunities to survive are not linked by whatever value a marketplace ascribes to them. That's what we want.
Can I take you up just finally on because we've spoken a lot about the conceptual aspects of the book, but in the second and then also the third part, there are a number of reflections drawn from some of your columns on solutions and other practical problems. And the one I wanted to focus on was this question of the cost of data, because you speak about an experience, a trip to India. I also happened to go to India 2 years ago, and I was just shocked at how cheap data was there. Take us through that and the consequences for this economy of this ridiculous situation in which we can't get ourselves out of this expensive data situation.
Sure. So yeah, man, I had an opportunity in 2019. So Innovate, I think there's a group called Innovate and Investec, have these trips they take entrepreneurs on. So I'm also, aside from being a broadcaster and sort of economist and an entrepreneur as well, I run my own business and have been doing so for the last 5 years or so. So I had this chance to go to Bangalore, and I'd been following, the emergence of the digital economy and the role, for instance, Naspers played in that, not just here at home, but even in places like India. And it was a great opportunity because what it did was to allow me to analyze the political undercurrents of that post-colonial society, which are very similar to ours here, I must say. If you think about, the Indian National Congress as a center-left turning into a social democratic and then later neoliberal type of political formation, a a lot of the dissatisfaction in India around that political project and the dynasty politics that has uncovered was in many ways was outpoured in reaction, so reactionary politics. So if you look at the type of nationalism of the BJP, which Narendra Modi leads now, you become very clear that this is not a progressive type of nationalism or a nationalism of the oppressed that has an internationalist outlook and links to the global south. It's not that type of politics. It's more a Trump-esque, type of nationalist project. Now, you think about that, and we were there at the time when the elections were happening. So you can imagine, I mean, this is a very interesting time, very charged political environment. But we then go to anything from film studios to Flipkart, which was at some stage owned by Naspers, and they sold it, which has become now one of the biggest e-commerce platforms in that country. And towards the tail end of the trip, I mean, one thing became very apparent, and it should have been apparent much earlier. The rise of all of these massive digital entities, some of whom didn't even have offices, but were turning over, mind-boggling amounts of money, or were working in very small spaces with a remote workforce. This is before COVID. Was that all of this would not have been possible if it wasn't for the ubiquitous access to data. So somebody had created a model where they made smartphones accessible. They then made data accessible, like a gig for 7 Rand or something like that, I think at the time. And what you ended up having was a system where an entire economy was catalyzed because there were low barriers to entry into accessing digital services. So when we went to Flipkart was able to tell us that they were running, 50 million users on their platform daily. And of that, over 50% of those were coming from rural India. So what you end up having to do is to now create an entire freight and logistics framework that leapfrogs the creation of roads in order to get that stuff to the consumer. And what I'm trying to argue in the paper where I make these comparisons is that we have the perfect storm in this country. We've got a double whammy of interests. So on the one hand, you've got a very oligopolistic telecom sector, main players who've made all the investments in capital, who effectively own and corner the market. You then also have a regulatory framework that in many ways is yet still to catch up with how technology changes, even how you do regulation. So this idea that you can run a bill through Parliament and hope for 3 years maybe that you'll get something at the end doesn't lend itself to the pace of change of exponential and lead technologies. And you're then stuck in the middle of that as the consumer. So one of the ways that, in a practical sense, and maybe this might come up in the next book, is that we then decided to go and get a license from ICASA in 2019. And we asked ICASA for a license for one of the districts there in the Eastern Cape. And we said, what would it mean for us to create Wi-Fi hotspots in this area where people are buying 1 gigabyte of data for more than 100 Rand? And we then flipped that on it and said, here's a component of Wi-Fi that's free, and here's a component where you can get a token for 10 Rand for 1 gigabyte. Will this in any way lead to downward pressure, as the economic training would say, on the costs of data? So it goes back to the same reservation wage argument. If you create an alternative, in many ways you bring downward pressure on those wages, and in the case of wages, it's the other way around. So if you create an alternative, people will ask for higher entry-level wages. And similarly here, we're arguing that if you can place that downward pressure on, the price of a 500 megabytes or a gigabyte of data, will that over time change the pricing behavior and the accessibility of some of these things? Because we are interested in not only the digital, but the real economy outcomes of that. The person who now had a bakkie, who now is interested in a courier operation, rather than, making that bakkie stand in the sun the whole time while it depreciates. Those are the types of very practical economic things that we're interested in. And as we learn, there's a process of then feeding that into the policy process. And I think that for me is the mark of an experimental and developmental state. If you are interested in saying, what if we did this? What would it mean for the configuration of market relations in that society? And I think as a generation, we have to be interested in being those people in how we exercise power, how we exercise influence. That says, let's take this risk. In what we'll lose, we'll probably gain in what we've learned.
So, Ayabonga, thanks so much for sharing your insights on SMWX. It's been a fascinating discussion. Those who are members of this channel will be able to watch some of our further bonus content. But we really thank you for coming on SMWX and sharing your insights.
Yeah, man, Sizwe, thanks a lot. And long may the great work that you do continue. And yeah, man, I think you're doing great work, and you continue to inspire us to push ourselves and to think in very meaningful ways about how we solve all of the things we see around us.
Appreciate that, bro.